Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. So today's presentation is part of the 2022 AUTHORTUBE Writing Conference. I'm Shaylin Bishop and the presentation today is the forgotten point of view using second person. I'm so excited to be chatting about point of view, one of my favorite writing topics, and especially second person today. Because this is a pre-recorded presentation, I won't be able to answer any of your questions live, so the Q&A portion of this presentation will just be done in the chat at the end of the video, or you can leave any of your questions as comments and I'll answer them in the days following the presentation. You can check out all the other events and presentations on the AUTHORTUBE Writing Conference website, which I'll leave a link to in the description. So today we're talking about second person, or as I've dubbed it, the forgotten point of view, because who writes in second person? Even if you're an avid reader, which I'm guessing a lot of you guys are, you may have never read a full novel or even a short story in second person before. It's definitely not the most used point of view. I kind of like to think of it as like if the point of view was a family, you know, like omniscient point of view is like the grandpa of the family, you know? Second person is kind of like that weird estranged cousin that everyone theorizes was probably adopted and they show up to a family reunion once every 5 years. Otherwise, no one knows what they're doing. You were probably taught what second person is in school along with third person omniscient, third person limited, and first person. And the TLDR was probably, and then there's second person, which we don't use, and it's not really talked about. It is definitely not the most popular point of view choice. I will admit to being somewhat of a second person apologist in that I love writing in second person. I am working on a novel that is in second person, and even though it's pretty unconventional, it's not something that a lot of writers use, it's not something that a lot of readers are called to. I think it has really unique uses and it can have a very unique effect that you can't achieve in other points of view. And because it is so rare, as much as I wish it were more common and a little more normalized so it would be a bit easier to publish, because it is so rare, it does have that immediate kind of wow, this is unique factor to it. It immediately stands out, and I think to a reader who's open to second person, immediately draws them in its uniqueness as well. I love second person. I think it can feel exceptionally intimate and turbulent and chaotic, like we're stuck in a feedback loop within the main character's mind, and it just can have some very unique effects that you don't get in other works. So I'm really excited to chat about second person today, the different types of second person, how it is, how it works, and why or why not you might want to consider using it. So let's start by talking about defining second person. What is second person? Well, before we can talk about what second person is, we have to talk about what point of view is and why it's so important. Point of view is the angle that your story is being told from. And it determines the relationship between the narrator, the protagonist, the audience, and the story. Think of it this way. Imagine you have an object sitting on a table. If you were to shine a light on it from one angle, and then you were to start rotating the light around the object, you would get a completely different view of the object. It would be entirely different. Different parts would be illuminated and different parts would be shadowed because of the point of view. And that's like what point of view is to a story. It's the angle that you're looking at the story from. It's going to highlight and eclipse certain things. So the point of view can affect or determine the psychic distance, which is how close the narrative is to the character and by extension how close the reader will feel to the story. It can also affect a story's chronology and structure, along with the voice, the tone, and even a piece's themes. Primarily, point of view affects how the protagonist is framed within the narrative. It's the relationship that the protagonist has to the story. Are they telling the story directly? Are the narrator and the protagonist the same or separate? What is the narrative's tone towards the protagonist? Is there any kind of framing device? How does the protagonist feel about their own narrative? And is it the same as the narrator? What is the temporal relationship between story and narrator? So how much time has passed between the events and the narrator telling the story? Every point of view will give you a different type of access to a story, and this isn't cut and dry. Essentially, there are infinite point of views, but we group them into general categories, things like first person, second person, third person, but point of view is always uniquely constructed within a certain piece. First person can accomplish very different things depending on the case that it's used for. So this isn't an exhaustive list or like a cut and dry thing, first person always does this, second person always does this. But these are some things that some of the more common point of views can accomplish and reasons why you might use them. So first person present tense might show a character experiencing a story in real time. You can actually get close to a real-time effect in first person present tense. It shows a character reacting to and processing events as they happen. It feels closest and most reflective of real life and how we experience things, and it orients the story in relation to the character's immediate emotional reactions. On the other hand, first-person past tense might show a character processing a story that has already happened. We might show the character recalling, reliving, or retelling the events for a specific reason. We can contrast what the character felt, who they were, and what they knew in the moment versus after the events. On the other hand, third-person limited might examine a character who's unaware that they have a story worth telling, or who wouldn't be able to adequately explain or articulate the story to us. For example, this is why you see a lot of really young child characters in third person. A child character probably can't articulate their story to the reader. In third person limited, we can also have insight to a character who wouldn't provide the details of their story willingly, and it allows more control over the psychic distance. On the other hand, third person omniscient can be used to explore a story whose scope is beyond the protagonist's understanding, and can also give us a greater separation between protagonist and narrator. So now that we've talked about the general qualities of point of view, let's get back to the lady of the hour, second person. What is second person? So second person is point of view that uses a you pronoun. I like to think of it as first person turned inside out. It shares a lot in common with first person, but the angle is different. In first person, the narrator tells the story to a reader, whereas in second person, this is flipped inside out, and the narrator is addressing the story back to the protagonist. Because second person reflects the story back at the narrator, it can allow you to access aspects of your character's psychology that other point of views wouldn't allow you to access, and this is ultimately the fun of point of view. Different point of views give you different access to your character's psychology, and so when you're picking the best point of view for your story, you want to pick the point of view that's going to best showcase the most interesting aspects of your character. And there are certain characters where second person best showcases the most interesting aspects of their psyches. So let's talk about some misconceptions about second person, because there are a lot of misconceptions about this point of view. The most common is that second person means that the reader is the narrator. This is a very commonly taught idea about how second person works. It's how I was taught second person in high school. I was told that it means that the reader is the character, that the you is the reader, but this is very rarely the case. Many readers fundamentally dislike second person because they say that as a matter of principle, they don't like being told that they did things that they would never do. They feel like the story is telling them that they are a certain way and that they would do a certain thing, and they think, but I wouldn't do that. I'm not that way. And so they fundamentally don't like the point of view. Ironically though, this is a very rare application of second person. So the main reason why most readers say they don't like second person is actually because of a misconception. It's not true. This type of second person where the reader is the main character can be possible, but it's very rare. In most cases, the you in a second person narrative is the protagonist, and the second person reflects the protagonist talking to themselves, not the story telling a reader that they are the protagonist. It's like the story is telling the story to the protagonist rather than the protagonist telling the story to an audience. So here's an example. This is from the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. This book is in 3 different point of views, and one of them in second person, and it's probably, at least from what I can think, one of the most commercially successful examples of a book that is written significantly in second person. And the usage of second person is really compelling, but it perfectly, from the first sentence that we begin this second person narrative, establishes that the second person narrator is not the reader. So I have 2 quotes here. What this book does that's, I think, very clever. It's a high fantasy book, and so there's maybe the assumption that high fantasy is usually not told in second person. And so I think the narrative understands that it needs to explain the boundaries of the point of view within the narrative. And it does that, and it does that really, really clearly, but in a way that's very natural. So the first chapter in second person begins with this quote: "You are she is you are a son. Remember the woman whose son is dead." So from the very beginning, the first line, we're told that this second person, this you, is a named character. I know that that's not my name, and so I immediately know as the reader, okay, this isn't a story about me, and the you isn't me. The you is this woman. We're told here, like, you are she. So if this was a third person narrative, we'd be reading it as Essen's point of view, and it would be written about her, you know. A little while later, in the next chapter from Essen's point of view, we get this quote: "You're still trying to decide who to be. The self you've been lately doesn't make sense anymore. That woman died with Uche. She's not useful. Unobtrusive as she is, quiet as she is, ordinary as she is, not when such extraordinary things have happened. So this quote basically relays the reason for the second person. The main character has gone through something very traumatic. She's witnessed one of her children be killed, and so she's essentially dissociating from her sense of self. She's separating from the person that she was, and she's creating a new sense of self, which is what the second person reflects. This disconnect from her identity that witnessing one of her children murdered and her other child go missing has caused her. So we're told very clearly in the narrative why the piece is in second person, what the second person means, and who the you is in relation to the story. It's the main character named Essen. It's not the reader. So the next common misconception about second person is that second person either pushes the reader away or draws the reader closer. And I hear both of these all the time, which is why I'm putting it as a misconception. And the truth is that either can be true. It just depends on the case. Second person can push the reader away, but it could also be closer. There's debate over whether second person is closer than first person. And it just depends. There will be cases where it's psychically further and cases where it's psychically closer. Whether the second person is increasing or decreasing the psychic distance just depends on the piece. And the next misconception is that second person is an unnatural way of telling a story. The thing about second person is that it's actually very natural and intuitive. We just don't use it a lot in fiction. But we use second person in our day-to-day lives all the time. If you've ever told a story and you began with the phrase, "you know when," and you proceeded to tell a story about yourself, you've used narrative second person in your spoken day-to-day life. Everyone who's listening to the story knows that what you're saying is, "this happened to me, but I think you'll all relate." Or they could also understand it to mean something like, "this happened, but it was really embarrassing. So I'm gonna say you because I don't want to admit that it was me, even though we all know that it was me." These are common, intuitive, natural uses of second person that we all use in day-to-day life, and we just intuitively know what they mean. So it's actually a very natural way of storytelling. It just hasn't translated to a very popular point of view choice in published fiction. So now let's talk about the types of second person. Like I said earlier, second person is going to be very uniquely constructed depending on the piece, like any point of view. So ultimately, it's not necessarily that you're going to be identifying one of these categories and just neatly fitting your book into that category. There are so many infinite ways that you could use second person, but these are some common types of second person and some common different uses of second person. First of all is what I like to call second person pure. This is that reader is the you type of second person that you were maybe taught in a high school English class. This is when the you is the reader, so the reader is meant to be the main character. This is a very rare type of second person that directly implicates the reader in the action. It's not that it can't exist. I know I said earlier that it was a misconception. It can still exist, this type of second person, but it's a very rare use of second person. So the most common use of this point of view is actually reader insert fan fiction. If you've read a lot of fan fiction, you've probably encountered this. Another use would be thrillers. Rare, it's not like you see a ton of thrillers in second person, but you could write a thriller that's in second person that's meant to be extremely immediate and extremely high stakes because you are the main character. And another possible use would be a book that is trying to place the reader in context of an issue or topic. So for example, if I'm writing a book about a specific topic, I'm addressing the book to a specific audience. And maybe I'm trying to educate a specific audience and be like, this is who you are in relation to the thing that I am talking about. So in this case, the you is kind of a general you. It's all of you people and how you relate to this topic that I'm talking about. Again, not that this is common, but it's a way of using second person pure. So next up is the most common type of second person, and it's second person interior. This is essentially first person in second person. So it's written very similar to how you would write first person. You just have a you instead of an I. Essentially, the you is the character telling the story to themselves. So while first person projects the story outwards, second person interior projects the story inwards. The audience is the main character. That's why some people might say that this point of view feels more intimate with them than first person. First person, which is meant to be extremely close, extremely intimate. Some might say that this point of view feels closer to them in certain cases because it's literally the main character speaking to themselves, which is such an intimate and personal thing. Second person interior, or it's also sometimes called second person intimate stories, have a distinct protagonist who is not the reader. Just like in first person, this character can be named and they can have distinct traits about them. So you can use this point of view to show a character dissociating from themselves, perhaps due to something like guilt or trauma. You can show the main character telling the story to themselves in order to process it. You can show the main character telling the story only to themselves because they could never tell it to another person. Or a main character who struggles to acknowledge that the story is about them. So here's an example. This is from a short story called Mountain Under Sea by D.W. Wilson. You can find the rest of the story online on CBC Books. It has a second person narrator, and even though we don't know the main character's name, we know distinct things about him, and he is a clear, distinct character who is not the reader. Iggy rattles her phone onto the table between you. A 2-inch line, freezer burn pale, underscores her eye, where, in grade 10, she stopped a slap shot with her cheek. The doctor said you could pluck the stitches at home, so while Iggy sat on a low stool, you braced your elbow on the kitchen table and pinched that first thread with your tweezers. She told you not to make her less pretty. You said, worst case scenario, she covers the scar with a zipper tattoo. Think how easy Halloween will be, you say. The guys will go nutso. This easily would make sense in first person if you replace the you with an I, and we would understand that this is a first person narrative. But instead, we have the main character telling the story to himself rather than to an audience, like in typical first person. Now, an even more specific type of second person interior is second person instructional. This is a type of second person interior, so it's still the main character telling the story to themselves, but it has a more specific use. This is a type of second person where the narrative takes the form of an instruction manual directing the character through the story. It's usually done in present tense as well. Now, the story doesn't literally need to be in the form of a manual, it could be though, but it uses that type of tone to address the main character as a set of instructions. As a result, you often drop the you. So the sentence, you pick up the spool of thread, search for the end, and try to guide it through the eye of the needle, would become pick up the spool of thread, search for the end, and guide it through the eye of a needle. You can imagine that sentence in some kind of how-to manual about how to sew, but in this case, it's a sentence in a story. So again, you can use this to show characters who are directing themselves through the events for whatever reason, or you might use it to illustrate some kind of unique form. Journals, recipes, instruction manuals. The first thing I ever wrote that was in second person was a second person instructional story that was in the form of a stage play, because the main character was an actor, and so she was directing herself as if her life was a play. Probably the most famous example of second person instructional would be How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia by Mohsin Hamid, which takes the form of a self-help manual. So here's an example. This is from How to Be the Other Woman by Lori Moore, which is from her collection Self-Help. If you want to learn how to write second person, you should definitely check out this collection because half the stories are in second person. In this piece, we have a distinct narrator, a woman named Charlene, so we have a distinct character like we would, like in second person interior or first person, but the story takes an instructional approach and tone. Meet in expensive beige raincoats on a pea soupy night, like a detective movie. First, stand in front of Florsheim's 57th Street window, press your face closer to the glass, watch the fake velvet Hummels inside revolving around the wingtips. Some white shoes, like your father wears, are propped up with garlands on a small mound of chemical snow. All the stores have closed. You can see your breath on the glass. Draw a peace sign. You are waiting for a bus. In that second to last line there, draw a peace sign, the instructional tone. It doesn't say you draw a peace sign, it's draw a peace sign, like the story is a direction for the main character. Now, the final type of second person I wanted to talk about is first person referral or first person direct address. There are a lot of different names for this. Different people will call it different things, but you know it when you see it. In many ways, this is a type of first person, but it's kind of like a blend between first and second person, so I thought I would include it here. This is a first person narrator, so the protagonist isn't you, but another character is you. Imagine that the story is like a letter with a clear addressee. If you were writing a letter, it would be from first person. But because you're writing it to a direct person, you would refer to that person as you. So this gives a first-person narrative a distinct audience and a specific goal for being told, unlike kind of a general first person where we may not know the audience. Here's an example. This is actually from one of my own stories called Elise Holding a Deermouse, 1829, and I just really like this point of view a lot, so I use it a lot in my writing. The main character is meeting up with an old friend that she had kind of an unrequited crush on, and it's her thinking through and replaying their relationship as they meet up again for the first time. As I remember you, you were always holding something. You knew how to catch the gray doves who ruffled our university fountain. The freshman English students walking past in faux leather Oxfords, clutching worn volumes of Beowulf or Don Quixote, would shriek as their wings bucked in your palms. You held ladybugs, dried roses, clay pots, film cameras, suitcases, marzipan buttons you thumbed out of their wrappers. So as you can see in the story, there's an I character who's telling the story in first person, but the other character in the story is addressed as you because the story is being directed to that character. The main character is trying to make sense of their relationship, and so this other character is the audience of the piece, even though it's not literally a letter, and so the other character doesn't know that this narrative is about them. They're not actually going to read this narrative. The narrative is to them, it's directed to them. So let's talk about why second person. Second person gives you some very unique opportunities to showcase character psychology in a way that you can't do in other points of view. However, because it is so unconventional, it needs to be earned through a distinct purpose. As much as I yearn for a world where second person is so normalized that we don't have to justify it, at the moment it is a pretty unconventional choice, and a lot of agents, editors, and readers will turn their nose up at it. So you really do need to earn it and convince a reader that this is the best and only way to tell this story. So as a summary of some different uses of second person that I've mentioned throughout the video, most cases of second person will show a character who is disconnected from themselves or their story, will show a character dealing with intense guilt or trauma, show stories that are dealing with themes of identity or shifting or lacking sense of self. I recently wrote a short story that's in second person, and it's about identity theft, and so the main character is taking on another character's identity. So the story is told in second person because the main character is essentially shedding her past identity to become this other person. Or you could have a story that has a unique form that requires a second person. If you're writing a story in the form of a recipe, it would make sense naturally for it to be in second person. Or in some cases, you can use it to get past the walls that a character has up to a deeper level of character psychology. Maybe you just have a character who would not say these things in a first person narrative. Maybe they're too secretive, they're too closed off. And so you need second person to access their character. Now, it's not that because your story has one of these elements, it needs to be in second person. Just because your story has themes of guilt or trauma doesn't mean it should be in second person, or else we'd be seeing a lot more cases of second person. It really does need to be earned, carefully thought through, and probably be the best, if not only, way to tell your story. But if you can find the right story, it's worth experimenting with. On the flip side, why might you not want to write in second person? Second person really does need to be earned, and so you probably only want to take it on if you have a clear, distinct reason that the story can articulate why the piece needs to be in second person. Either the form should demand it, the character demand it, or ideally both should demand it. It's also very rare in novels, and so it might be better suited to short works, especially if it's your first foray into second person. If you have plans to write a novel in second person, I would definitely recommend experimenting with at least a couple, maybe several short stories in second person beforehand, so you can get your bearings. Because we often don't write in it, it can feel unnatural at first and take a bit of time to get your groove. And finally, you just want to be aware of the ways it can limit your book's audience. Personally, I always like to make choices about my writing's form and style for what I want and what I know to be best for the piece, but it is still important to be aware of the ways that second person can limit your audience. It's very rare in most genres, unheard of in some genres even, and so you do want to be aware of possible barriers to publication or possible ways that it might limit your audience. I wouldn't let that hold you back if it's what you want for your story, but do keep those things in mind, because as of yet, it's still a pretty unconventional point of view choice that a lot of people just aren't familiar enough with or educated enough with to be open to reading. I always like to prioritize the artistic effect that I want over the potential audience for the work. If second person is what is in your heart, don't let that stop you, and the more second person books that are out there and being published, the more that becomes a viable option for authors who want to explore that. So that's all for today's presentation on second person. If you have any questions, you can direct them over to the chat and I'll answer them there. Or if you just want to leave them in a comment where there will be more time for me to get to them and write out longer answers, I'll get to any questions in the comments over the next few days. Feel free to leave your favorite piece, whether that's a short story or a novel or anything that's in second person, in the chat as well, so that everyone here today can get a great list of possible examples and inspiration sources that they can turn to if they want to write a piece in second person. It can be hard to hunt them down since it's not very common, so if you have a favorite second person piece, please feel free to mention it or leave a comment, so there will be tons of possible inspiration for anyone looking for some for their own work. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.